Hello, everyone, and welcome. The library is officially open, which means it's time to read or be read. I'm Samita Mukhopadhyay.
And I'm Lucy Diavolo. It's midterm season, and that means it's almost time to vote.
Queer rights have developed a lot over the past decade, but the fight for equality is just beginning. In the upcoming midterm elections, the stakes for LGBTQ plus folks, and really all of us, are huge. We're really excited today to be joined by activist and writer Adam Ely, and writer and activist, Gabriel and gay man, Gabriel Arana.
You need all my titles?
Welcome. While the presidential elections garner far more interest than the midterms, we all kind of know that, right? The midterms tend to determine the balance of power in the states. The bulk of policies that affect queer Americans are actually happening in the Senate and the House. Gabe, talk to us a little bit about this project that you did about the 50 states of queer and why it was important to do.
So the 50 States of Queer project has a number of components. One is a feature I wrote about what is at stake for queer people in this upcoming election. Another portion of it looks at the state of queer rights after the gay marriage decision in 2015. And the third part, which is most directly related to the election, is a voter guide where users can go and stick in their address, and the page spits out your polling location, who's going to be on your ballot, and the candidates are given LGBT friendliness ratings. So the goal of it was really to inform queer people about the election.
Yeah,
it's comprehensive.
Really amazing tool, and honestly, not something I've ever heard of before. Why does it matter for queer people to get out the vote?
It matters in particular for the midterms because conservative voters have an advantage. Midterms is when they consolidate power in the states. And so if you look at state legislatures and governorships, most of them are Republican. You know, there are about half dozen states where both houses of the legislature and the governor's mansion are Republican. And it's really in midterm elections where progressive voters stay home and conservative voters come out at higher rates that they secure that advantage.
Can you talk about one state where, we would have seen things flipped had all queer voters come out?
Yeah, so one of the things we looked at for the project was what would the impact of queer voters have been on swing states. One of the ones we looked at was Michigan, where Trump won by a mere 13,000 votes. The number of LGBT voters who stayed home is around 150,000.
Oh my God.
So if
wow.
Yeah, so if queer people had only, had gotten 10% of their voters out, then it would have flipped the state.
Yeah. So Adam, often when we talk about the election, we talk about it in the national scheme of things, and often that can make an individual feel like their vote is not meaningful or it's not going to be effective. What is your advice for that person?
So I would say that is just objectively not true. Gabe just gave us a beautiful reason and beautiful example of Michigan of why that is not true, particularly if you're queer. I work with an organization called Swing Left, and they identify swing counties, which is a county that went red during the last election by a very thin margin. And if you give them your zip code, it'll give you tangible volunteer opportunities to try to, in very pointed places, to turn those swing counties blue in the hopes of taking back the House of Representatives. So if for whatever reason you're feeling like your vote doesn't matter, then get on a bus and volunteer, and it will become very clear very fast how much your vote and the votes that you might be able to influence do matter.
Can we talk about some of the key issues? I think it's easy to get wrapped up in the federal level, but you were just saying how this is a midterm election that's going to play out all across the country. So what issues should people be looking for in their states when it comes to the midterm elections?
So the Massachusetts legislature passed a law saying that you can't discriminate against transgender people in public accommodations, which are things like doctor's offices, the store, basically anything that's not home or work. Opponents of LGBT rights succeeded in getting this law on the referendum. So in Massachusetts, there's a process whereby you can gather enough signatures, and any act of the legislature that's passed, you can put it before the voters, and voters can say yes or no.
Because what your project does so well, I think, is makes clear how so much of this stuff happens on a state-by-state basis right now.
We talked about why it matters at the state level. It's really clear, and why it's important at the national level. But what are some other implications for a young queer person's vote in the United States?
So something I think that queer voters, particularly queer voters in Michigan, may not understand is that when you are voting, you're not just voting for your own rights or the rights of your friends or your communities. You're voting for the rights of queer people all over the world. And like, just for example, like the president appoints the Secretary of State and then the Senate has to confirm him, and he is in charge of foreign policy. He is in charge of representing American interests abroad, appointing ambassadors and dignitaries. There's also been a slide back of LGBT rights around the world. We have issues coming up in Eurasia, in like Chechnya and Uzbekistan, but also in Egypt and Indonesia, and almost every single day we're getting reports that things are just getting worse and worse and worse, and that contributes to the global refugee crisis. And the State Department let in the least amount of refugees since 1977 this year. That impacts the whole world, but particularly queer people who can't be themselves in their own country. When we talk about deportation, and when you hear about the deportations that ICE is doing, it's very possible that a queer person is going to be deported to a country where they can't be themselves. So at best, a queer person being deported is being forced back into the closet, but at worst and likely could be a death sentence. So when you vote, it's for you and your queer friends, or that queer person you know, but it's also for the queer person you don't know, whose life literally will depend on it.
I mean, after the elections, most likely Republicans will lose the House and they might lose the Senate, but just losing one House of Congress will put a significant check on President Trump's power. But after that, I mean, to really change the system, you need long-term engagement. So you vote, but you actually have to be active to make a lasting impact on the system, and change is really slow. And it can feel in the moment that your vote doesn't matter, but politics is a long-term game.
Absolutely. Before we go, we have to get to the go-off, the part of the show where we set aside a minute of uninterrupted airtime to go off.
I'm ready for this.
This week, Lucy Diavolo is going to do the honors. Okay, Google, set a timer for 60 seconds.
Okay, 1 minute, starting now.
Let's talk about Lawrence versus Texas, the 2003 Supreme Court case that finally invalidated Texas's anti-sodomy law. Until the Supreme Court ruling, Texas and 13 other states had laws on the book that made sodomy illegal, something you could be prosecuted for. It's not that uncommon that laws that don't really name queer people in the title targeted us, whether it's cross-dressing laws or whether it's the fact that I can't even change the name on my birth certificate in Ohio because I was born there. You need to vote in the midterms because these things are what happens when we're not empowering ourselves. In the meantime, you can keep throwing stones, you can keep raging about the Supreme Court and how it's getting further and further to the right. We're less likely to ever hear Gavin Grimm's case at the Supreme Court, and just pay them no mind, but you have to vote just for the one day. And that was my go off.
Go off.
She went off.
She went off.
She went all the way off.
So that's all our time for today. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us. Be sure to follow them on all of our socials, and we'll see you next time.